Hi there, Prep for Law students. This is Professor Tabo, and we're going to do a little bit of multitasking in this particular video because I am both going to be reviewing with you the steps in your daily study cycle or your daily study routine, or some things that you should be trying to incorporate, that I strongly encourage you to incorporate. But along the way, you're also going to get a little bit of exposure to one of my favorite study tools. It's a mind mapping tool called MindMup, and it is available for free at mindmup.com. And although there are a few sort of additional features that you have to pay for, namely if you want to be able to store an unlimited number of maps on their website, you have to pay an additional fee. But it's actually pretty awesome because nearly everything you could possibly want to do is available in the free version, particularly because MindMup allows you to very easily, with just a couple of clicks, to save all of your mind maps automatically to your Google Drive account. You guys know how much I love Google Drive. So there's really, in my mind, there's no reason why you would necessarily want to pay for the online storage. It is a pretty basic, pretty pared down mind mapping tool as far as these types of software tools are concerned, but I think it's perfect for law students and for law school. A lot of the pay packages, things like MindJet, they're really neat, they're really awesome. You can do all sorts of, funky stuff and animated stuff. But the reality is, for your purposes, you really just need something that is kind of the electronic version, a slightly neater version of, scribbling on a page. So I like MindMup particularly for that reason, and I really encourage you to give it a shot. It is the simplest interface you could possibly hope to deal with. This is actually what you'll see when you're logged in. You just kind of have this big whiteboard area and your tool functions over here. And I'll actually show you in a bit some of these tools and how to actually build a new mind map. But what I want to do now is actually show you via a mind map that I've already created here the steps in the study cycle. So again, we're multitasking here. So thinking about your study cycle, this is the routine that you want to get into day after day after day, from your first day, if not your first day of orientation in August, certainly your first day of actual class. I promise you that having a routine like this, substantially similar to this, and faithfully executing it, like a robot, day after day, is one of the best ways to ensure that by the time you get to those final exams, you are going to be in excellent shape. I know that some people are sort of skeptical of all of the steps that you will see. There are good reasons behind each of them. Some of them I explain here, but all of them I would be happy to explain. And the bottom line is the data really bear this out, that people who do these things each day throughout the semester fare the best on final exams. And you're in law school to do well, so let's talk about how you do well. So we will expand things out just a little bit here. And your basic steps each day, or roughly each day, will follow a pattern like this. So you're going to review at the beginning of a study session. You're going to preview what you're about to learn in that study session. You're going to spend the bulk of your time then, of course, absorbing the new material. Before you walk away and, take a break or change subjects, you're going to practice applying some of what you just learned. Then you're going to take a little bit of time right before class, preferably and this is part of your 1L schedule, you'll always have a 1-hour break in between your 1L classes. This is the time that you want to be doing the preparing for class. So a little bit of space in between these two time-wise. Then you're always going to obviously attend class. But then immediately after class, you're going to take a few minutes and you're going to recap what you just covered in class. So let's go through this in a bit more detail. So let's talk about when you are sitting down to begin a new session in the study cycle. What is it exactly that you're going to be doing? Basically, this means that for 5, 10, 15 minutes, something like that, again, when you first sit down saying, I'm about to study torts, you want to make sure that you take the time to situate yourself, to orient yourself in the material that you're going over in class. Part of the reason this becomes really useful is, honestly, you'll kind of get dizzy in your days in law school because you're so intensely focused on whatever class is right in front of you that it can sometimes be difficult to shift to a completely different course in a completely different subject matter. And if someone asked you, well, what did you talk about last class in contracts, you probably wouldn't be able to tell them. And that's okay, but that's why you want to have this review step. Is you want, in order to make the most of the study session that you're about to have, you want to make sure you know what it is that you just covered. So what are some ways that you can review for just a few minutes before you start on the new material? Well, one of the ways is going to be able to be skimming over your outline, right? So if, and you'll see how this works into the cycle, if you choose the option over here that involves actually updating your outline right after class, then that means the next day or later that evening or whenever you're starting a new study session, you want to skim through your outline up to that point. That's gonna reorient you. It's gonna remind you what you have been going over, and that way you're ready to move on to the next thing. If you haven't updated your outline at that point, this is a great time to do it. Everybody makes outlining out to be this like massive task that has to happen for like 6 hours on every Saturday or something. If you study this way, you can fit it in little bits along the way, and I promise you'll be in good shape. So 5 to 15 minutes of taking your handwritten notes, your briefs, your class outline or your class notes, all that good stuff, and putting it into that master outline that's based on your skeleton from your table of contents, from your casebook. You've got that in one document, and so now you're either sort of cutting and pasting things into the right parts just for that little chunk of the skeleton outline that you covered in the last class, or, and I think this is really a great way to go, if you hand wrote all of the briefs and notes and everything, then this is a chance for you to type those things up into the right portion of that skeleton outline. You're really just cutting and pasting and plugging things in at that point. And then, of course, part of outlining, too, is to clean things up a little bit, to edit a little bit, condense a little bit. But this is a great time to do that. You're not only getting the outlining function done, but you're also getting your mind in the right place for that course. Another sort of thing that you can do as a review before you start a new session is just something like flipping through flashcards, for example, right? So anything that's going to bring your head back to where it was when you were last actively studying this and not all the stuff that happened in your life in between. So that is how we review. After you've spent about 5 to 15 minutes reviewing, then you're going to preview. And when you're previewing, what that means is that you want to sort of look ahead to what it is that you are about to study, about to learn during that session. So a lot of times what this starts off with, of course, is simply, looking at your syllabus and seeing what the assignment for the next day is. That's going to be a good place to start. And actually one of the easiest things that you can do to preview, because this is really 5 minutes or less, is after you've opened up your casebook to the right pages, actually like sort of skim through the entire chapter, the entire chunk of assigned readings, and just glance through the headings or the labels attached to the case names that the casebook editors and authors have put in. That's going to give you a fairly good idea of what's to come, right? And that's going to give your brain something to be looking for as you start reading through the material. And then, of course, reading part of your master outline, the skeleton outline, that's empty right now, but is the part that you're about to fill in, right? So this is the chunk of stuff that you just see the skeleton outline, like your table of contents headings, and there's no further information in there, but what you're about to do is find the information that's going to fill that in. So this is another good way to kind of prep your brain for being on the lookout for answers as you start reading. So it'll make it more effective. The other thing is, jot down questions that you want to be able to answer by the end of your reading, by the end of the chapter or whatever. So, it doesn't have to be something super, super, super specific or complicated. It can be something as simple as, I'm about to read a chapter on anticipatory breach. What is anticipatory breach? By the way, that's a contracts term. Or, is it a trespass on your property if I dig underneath your yard? Right? So if we've been talking about trespass in torts for, the past couple of classes, this may be something that, I'm sort of wondering here. We haven't had any cases about that. I wonder whether that counts as a trespass or not. But anticipating those questions can be really good. And then the other thing is you can read or take notes from a treatise or a horn book on the topic, just on the chunk of material that that you're about to study. On the Center for Legal Pedagogy's blog, I posted some reading lists recently about supplemental readings for your summertime. And among the things that I put on that list were a few resources like the Understanding series of books, so Understanding Torts, Understanding Property, etc. Those would be examples of really good horn books or treatises to use for this kind of purpose. We'll talk more about study aids and treatises at another time, but just know that if you can get your hands on some sort of really concise summary of these ideas of law, not in cases, but just kind of in paragraph form, that can also be a really good way to get your mind in the right place. So now that you're all nice and previewed, let's get to the actual absorbing of new material. So this is undoubtedly the part of the study cycle that takes the most time. Reading for law school is a somewhat arduous process compared to certainly pleasure reading, but even other types of academic or professional reading. We will devote a few modules to various critical reading skills and sort of, reading speed skills and those sorts of things later on. But just know for now that your reading speed, especially during your first year when you're reading cases, is going to probably be about 10 pages an hour. And if you're like me, you have to actually really focus to keep up that pace. So 5 to 10 pages is not uncommon. So that's something you're going to have to sort of budget for. But you're also going to be briefing cases as you read them. And the majority of your reading in your first year of law school is all cases. And again, we have 2 modules devoted just to briefing cases. So don't worry about the details of that yet. But just know that as you're absorbing this material, some things to keep in mind that you should make a part of your routine and your habits is you definitely want to be writing margin notes as you go along. So plan to write in your books, plan to make them dirty, plan to make them yours. So you should be writing things like keywords and phrases out in the margin. Also try highlighting and color coding the text in your books. This is not a replacement for taking notes or briefing cases or writing margin notes, but it is an excellent way to highlight, no pun intended, to highlight the different parts of a case. So for example, you might decide that in your coding system, anything that's highlighted in green is the facts of the case. Rationale of the case, the court's reasoning, is going to be in blue, and then that all-important holding of the case, that is what the court says the answer to the legal question is going to be in red, right? And doing something like that is going to be helpful just because if you glance down at the book in class, you're going to immediately be able to find what you're looking for. It's almost like tabbing more than it is a replacement for note-taking, but we'll talk about that more when we talk about reading strategies. Then the other thing that I want to point out here is that you do want to write up your brief for each case at the end of reading it, right? So what you don't want to do, and this isn't immediately obvious, you don't want to wait until the end of, say, the chapter or the end of the reading assignment and then go back and brief all of the cases at once. You don't want to think of it like, well, I've got a reading assignment to do, and then I also have a briefing assignment to do. Briefing is something that you want to be doing as you go along with the cases. You also want to make sure that you are jotting down any questions that you have as you're reading. This is a good way to stay active, and it's a good way to sort of anticipate what may go on in class. And then the other thing I strongly encourage is make sure that you're using images as much as possible, visual imagery, to encode those ideas, that is, to sort of bake them into your brain, translate them into thoughts, and then, of course, to trigger your memory later. And visual imagery is great for that encoding, and it's great for activating your memory. So even if you are just, for example, drawing, kind of stick figure level drawings next to the heading of each of the cases as you read them, something that is just intended for you, that's going to trigger your memory, that can actually be a fantastic way to really make sure that you're learning and remembering the contents of your case. It's amazing how that works. And the other thing, especially when you're taking notes or translating notes into an electronic form, is it's great to be able to sort of paste images and paste media into your notes. And here's actually an example. So this is an actual case. This is an incredibly important. I do First Amendment constitutional scholarship, and Morse v. Frederick is a very important United States Supreme Court decision on the First Amendment about whether or not public school students have the sort of unlimited or nearly unlimited First Amendment rights that we might expect if they were sort of adults off campus in kind of the prototypical situation. But bottom line is, if you and I, copied and pasted both the picture and the case information. I, copied and pasted from different sources. But you got to remember bong hits for J. I mean, you plug that into your notes, and it's definitely going to trigger your memory. Remembering Morse v. Frederick, that phrase is going to be a whole lot harder than, remembering bong hits for Jesus. They were protesting at a student activity. Anyway, so that would be an example of how to, you can really make your notes a whole lot more effective by adding some images. So you are going to be absorbing lots of stuff through reading and briefing, and doing that very, very efficiently, very effectively. And then you will immediately, before your study session ends, before you get up and walk away, you're going to take a few minutes to apply what you just read and what you just learned. So what do we mean by apply? Let me make that, no. Sorry. Let's go, there we go. That's what I'm talking about. So at the conclusion of reading, you will want to take about 5 to 10, maybe 15 minutes to essentially to practice a little bit. Practice questions of various sorts are a necessary part of your daily and weekly study routine. Doing practice questions with the law is not an activity that you save for studying for final exams, for example. The reason for that is honestly one of the hardest parts about law school exams, and in fact about law period, is that you have to be able to take all of this black letter law, we call it, right? So just sort of the text of the law, memorizing those rules, those statutes and one sentence holdings, taking that information and translating it into this practical ability to look at a story, hear a story, and immediately see the law in that new set of facts. or to take the law that you know and, apply it to slightly different facts. And it's that cognitive skill that makes law so challenging. And so if you're not exercising that part of your brain throughout the semester and throughout the year, it's just not enough time during finals period to somehow catch up on that. So it is so much better to do 5 minutes, and you can do 5 minutes of practice at the end of every reading session than it is to do 6 hours worth of practice during final exam time. So, woo, there we go. So what are some of the things that you can do when you're in your application time at the end of every reading session? Well, one obvious thing is in about 5 to 15 minutes, you can do, say, 4 or 5 multiple choice questions. Usually the standard for law multiple choice questions is about 2 minutes per question. So that works out pretty well. It gives you time to, review the right answers. Some great sources for multiple choice questions, Barbary, Kaplan, the other sort of, bar exam preparation companies have tons and tons of materials. If you haven't already gotten a hold of some of those, you certainly can early on in law school, because these companies come to campus and will sell you stuff in our lobby. They're great sources. Their tools are great sources of multiple choice questions. During orientation, you will be given a flash drive, a preloaded flash drive that has a bunch of resources on it. Among those resources is a whole other set of a few hundred multiple choice questions from a company called FINS. Also, if you do the 1L Skills Academy in the fall, and you'll learn more about that later, then you're given access to Barbary AMP software, which is this really cool adaptive software that sort of learns what you're good at and what you're weaker at, and works you on just the content areas and types of questions that you're weak at. So it's very targeted and strategic practice. It's a fantastic program. Anyway, so those are some ways that you can do just a handful of multiple choice questions right at the very, very end of reading. But you can also write up your own fact patterns and hypotheticals, something that corresponds with, what were the few rules of law that you just learned, that you just read. Well, your cases themselves are essentially going to be fact patterns, right? They're stories. But you can write your own fact patterns, your own hypos. So one way to think of this is, what is it that you're picturing in your mind when you imagine an actual real client coming in and telling you her story, if it's the sort of story that you as a lawyer would say, oh, no, that sounds like anticipatory breach to me. So picture that. You can also sort of list out variations on the facts of the cases that you just read. So for example, if you are studying burglary in criminal law, so burglary is the breaking and entering of a dwelling house at nighttime with the intent to commit a felony inside, right? Those are elements of burglary. So you might sort of say to yourself, well, I was just reading Bob versus State, and in that case, court said that Bob was guilty of burglary because he broke into Sally's house in the middle of the night in order to steal her TV. Well, but that's burglary. But what if Bob broke into her house to steal the TV at noon? Would that still be burglary? No, because it's not at nighttime. Well, what if Bob broke into her house at dusk, meaning to steal her TV? Well, does dusk count as nighttime? Does it count as daytime? How would we argue that? What if Bob broke into Sally's store instead of her house? Playing around with those sorts of hypotheticals and actually like making a little chart for yourself, just scribbling out a chart, is such a good way to learn to think like a lawyer, because thinking in terms of hypotheticals, comparing and contrasting hypotheticals, is one of the primary ways that we actually reason as lawyers, and we'll talk about that more too. So there are lots of ways to go about doing this. The other thing that you can do during your practice time is just write 1 or 2 really short essay responses to essay questions, once again on the topic that you just read about. My favorite source for these short essay questions, along with really great explanations is the examples and explanations series. And I mentioned that actually in the recent blog post about summer reading as well. Absolutely fantastic for that purpose. Siegel's is another good source of essay questions for law school. And if you find yourself constantly veering away from doing essay question practice because you feel like, well, I mean, geez, I know this stuff. It takes so long to put it into words and actually write it out. If you find yourself experiencing that very often, remember this. If you can't easily articulate your answer in writing, then you don't really know the answer. Practice time. That's the time to figure out that maybe you don't know it as well as you feel like you do. If you're not able to articulate it, figure it out now when you still have time to do it. Do something about it as opposed to while you're on an exam and you're trying to articulate it. So those are some of the many options for your daily time. Again, even just 5 to 10 minutes at the end of each reading session that you are going to practice what you know. So after you've reviewed, previewed, absorbed, and applied, you're presumably going to sort of walk away from your study for a while. Now, in many cases, the reality in law school is that means that after this step, you're going to switch subjects. So you reviewed, previewed, absorbed, and applied for contracts, and now it's time to move on to torts, and you're going to review, preview, absorb, and apply for torts. Though, of course, it may be the end of the day, but mostly it's going to be, again, sort of a lather, rinse, repeat kind of deal here, where you're following these steps, but you're following it with new material. But after you've completed sort of the typical out of class, before class portion, you want to make sure that you devote a little bit of extra time close to the class meeting to prepare a little bit, right? So one way, a very common way of doing this is maybe you did this stuff the night before class, and then the morning of class or shortly before class, you're going to spend another 10 to 20 minutes prepping. Now, the reason that you are doing some separate preparation is in part for the sort of reason for why you reviewed here, right? You're going to be thinking about lots and lots of other things and other areas of law. Some areas of law, even in your first year, use similar jargon to mean different things. So torts and crim will both be talking about causation, and the concepts of causation that apply in torts are dead wrong in crim and vice versa. And that can get very confusing. So taking the time to prep yourself for the class you're about to walk into is really time well spent. What is it that you are going to be doing during this prepping? Well, one great thing to do is to skim your briefs and notes from, the night before, whenever you were doing your study session. And going along with this, what you want to be thinking as you're skimming through your briefs and your notes is I want you to actually picture yourself being called on in class and answering the professor's questions. Or briefing the case. Briefing the case is sort of a law school term for being called on and asked to recite the facts of the case and summarize the court's rationale and kind of, go on this little mini oration for the class. And it can be a little scary at first, but it will happen. And if you picture yourself responding to the challenge in advance, you're going to be much better prepared to deal with it. So one of the things that I recommend is that you actually, as you're skimming before class, try to actually predict what your professor is likely to ask, and see if you can formulate an answer to it. That's one great strategy. Another thing, and I recommend you do this in private, is if at all possible, actually speak aloud. If you're doing this right before class, some good, go to the bathroom, go to a corner outside the building, go sit in your car for a few minutes. You don't have to, no one has to think that you're schizophrenic, but there are good reasons why it's worth speaking these things aloud, actually saying the words out loud. One is that when you form complete sentences, that is, you're actually having to say the words and you're not just reading over them passively, that's actually going to help to train you to speak in a, slightly more lawyerly way. A lot of times in class, people will kind of have the right idea, but when they're so nervous when they get called on, that they tend to sort of stammer out single words and phrases, and they get yelled at by professors because that's not a complete answer, and it can be very, it can be very frustrating. The more you practice describing the case that you read and the principles of law in full, complete sentences, the less nervous you will be, the more natural that will be for you when you're in class. And similarly, you want to get used to talking like a lawyer. And what I mean by that really is that there is a tremendous amount of jargon in terms of art involved in lawyering. It will initially sound strange coming out of your own mouth, and you may feel a little bit sheepish, like using all of this highfalutin language. But the more you use it, the more it becomes your own. And so you really do want to be comfortable with that. So listen to yourself speak. Probably the most important part, though, about speaking aloud as a means of prepping for class is that hearing yourself talk, hearing yourself say things, actually activates more parts of your brain than simply reading would. So roughly the way you want to think of this is that you're going to learn more, and importantly, you're going to remember more when you are hearing yourself read than if you were just reading alone. This is an important strategy when you're reviewing material too, but this is a great time in the cycle to do it, is before you go into class. A couple of other strategies for ways that you can prep for your class in about 10 to 20 minutes. One is to kind of create a little cheat sheet for yourself for class. Say a one-page document that's just all of the, the most important things from what you read. It's not going to replace your briefs or your notes. It's just a bunch of stuff that's going to trigger your memory, including, once again, things like pictures and keywords and whatever. This is a good time to prepare it. Also, creating a visual outline or diagram, right? So something like what we're looking at here, that can be a good way to kind of recap all that material, have it fresh in your mind so that you're ready to go into class. The other thing is that this time, this 10 to 20 minute time, is a fantastic time in the study cycle to essentially type up any handwritten notes or briefs that you have from earlier in the study cycle. I'm a big fan of handwriting. I'll talk more about that as we go on. But there are real advantages to ultimately having a typed up version of your documents. And this is a really good time to do that, is right before class, go through all your handwritten stuff, type it up, transcribe it. And the important thing here is it's not actually a waste of time, because that process of rewriting something is actually really useful memory practice. That's a good way to memorize something, even independent of the fact that, it's kind of cool that you have a neater version afterwards. So this can actually be useful, even if you, even if, for example, you already typed up your briefs or you are handwriting again. That recapping process that goes on when you're transcribing it over is actually quite good for you. So after you have prepared for class, you are then going to attend class. We do have mandatory attendance requirements, so you will attend class. But what happens when you're in class? Well, some things to keep in mind. One is that you really want to focus on filling in your notes and briefs from the night before, your reading notes, with margin notes. So further explanations, things that you might have written down in some form or fashion the night before. Further illustrations, any points that you might have missed. A good way to think of it is filling in the notes from the night before, though. What you are not going to do is be a court stenographer here. You're not going to just be trying to transcribe as much as possible and not pay attention. You don't want a script of the class. You want to try to stay engaged, stay focused on the conversation itself, and use it as a time to learn about your professor and what your professor thinks is most important. You read the cases, you know the law. The exam is going to be given not by the law, but by your prof. And so class is really a great time to be learning what particular topics your professor cares most about, even as compared to every other professor at Thurgood Marshall who teaches the same class. And what's likely to be on the exam, or what's likely to be a focus. You want to minimize distractions. I have my little clippy here. I think I gave you guys this link already. This is from the blog. If you find yourself getting distracted while using a laptop in class, or distracted by your phone in class, I'm dead serious here. It hurts no one more than you to be distracted by that kind of stuff while you're in class. So use something like Lightroom or Darkroom that, even if you are typing, if you just absolutely have to type your notes in class, use one of these programs that's going to block out other stuff on your computer while you're in it, so that it's just that much harder for you to get distracted by anything else. You just see the screen that you're typing on. Or use something, like Leech Block or one of these other focus applications that will block you out of particular sites that may be strongly tempting. So, we all know what those sites are. But keep that in mind. It really is your responsibility to manage yourself in that way. And I, as a professor, it doesn't bother me that people aren't paying attention, but it makes me sad that they're not paying attention. You're sitting there quietly, but I know that you're not getting as much out of the time as you should, and you'd be more, if you were just going to be looking at Facebook, I wish that you could just be at home looking at Facebook, but anyway, that's a whole other story. The other thing is, if possible, handwrite your notes, don't type them. I love technology. I am imposing so much technology on you in Prep for Law, but there is something absolutely magical that happens when you are handwriting versus typing. And this is actually the attachment here on this note of the map is an article, a recent article, June 3rd, 2014, from Scientific American, and you can actually pull this up online. It's pretty awesome. It was all over the news this past week, though it's been something that people have suspected. Namely that, the upshot for you is, even if you are a fantastic typist and you say, I type so fast, I can't possibly handwrite my notes in class because it's just so much easier for me to type. I can get so much more down. Part of the problem is notes aren't about volume, right? Notes aren't more useful to you simply because you get more of them, more lines on the page. They're really most useful to you when they're indicative of cognition, when they're indicative of you actually thinking about what it is that you're writing, and therefore beginning to memorize. And for a variety of interesting reasons that we can talk about at another time, handwriting is going to help to embed things in your memory a whole lot more. Among other reasons, simply because you have to think a bit more about what it is that you're putting down on the page and how you phrase it. So, if possible, you'll actually learn more if you handwrite. And then, like I said, you can type things up on your own as an additional step later. So that is class. The final thing in your study cycle that you want to be paying attention to is something that you're going to do, a step that you're going to go through immediately after class. And I kind of, there's sort of two different paths to go here. One is if you have another class or another, scheduling obligation shortly after, then just take 5 to 10 minutes after class to recap. 5 to 10 minutes is a length of time that honestly, even if you have back-to-back classes like at Thurgood, you never will your first year. But in your second and third year, if you have 2 classes, there's a break in between that's built into our class schedule times. You have 5 minutes. You get so much out of doing these things at the very end of class before you move on to the next, before you even get up out of your seat. In many cases, you can do these things. One is you want to go read through your notes from class and make sure you fill in any gaps that are left. Incomplete thoughts need to be filled in, need to be completed. Do your notes make sense now that you're looking at them? Can you read your handwriting? Do you remember what your abbreviations stand for? If you're using a bunch of abbreviations, quickly scribble out a little code for yourself so you can decipher it later. These things are really important in part because remember, you are not going to remember months from now what a particular abbreviation meant. And while it makes good sense to use those sorts of abbreviations and whatnot and, scribbles while you're taking notes at the time, at some point you want to make sure that you've got something that you can look back on 6 months from now and make sense of. Take the time to do all this stuff while it's fresh in your mind. Make sure you've got clear, concise, precise rule statements for those few rules of law that you will have covered in that day's class. Again, get this stuff down while it's all still fresh in your mind. That 5 minutes will pay some pretty steep rewards. Collapse that guy there. And so this is pretty much the pattern that you are going to follow day after day, class after class. Review, preview, absorb for most of the time, a little bit of application. Then, the next day or whenever you're about to go into class, spend another few minutes prepping for class, including outlining in many cases. Go to class, and then recap just a little bit. I promise if you follow this pattern, with each of these discrete tasks in your study cycle, you will learn and memorize and assimilate so much more information, so much more easily than if you spent the same amount of time, the same number of minutes, just opening up a book and reading it, or just reading over an outline, or whatever. The part of the beauty of this pattern is what each of these distinct steps does for you. It's not about time, it's about what you're doing during that time that makes this so effective. So the last thing I wanted to talk about real briefly is going back to thinking of this display as a mind mapping tool, right? Like I said, we're going back to the multitasking. You've watched a few of the cool things that you can build into your mind maps. So for example, this whole expansion deal, you start off with a node, and this leaf lets you expand the node. And that's, frankly, is pretty awesome, because you can make these absolutely ginormous mind maps that would be kind of sprawling and unmanageable otherwise, but you can just unfold them as you go along and as you need to read them. So that's really cool. So roughly how you make one of these, and I'll make this brief, is you always start with one of these center nodes. And to add a node, like I just did, you go to this icon, and it's called adding a child. And so you've got you've got a child there, you can change the color. If you want to add a child to that, you can add a child to that. You can add multiple children. All that good stuff. You also, you can insert parents. So this would be the parent of these guys. So you can insert more nodes. You're also able to attach files. This is how I plugged in the Scientific American stuff and the Bong Hits for Jesus. You can just cut and paste files. And once again, it's going to be tucked away behind the node until you click on it. So that's pretty cool. You can do the same thing with images. You've got a lot of options here. I don't want to ruin my pretty study cycle thing. And you can play around with it. There are more things to do with it than you could possibly imagine, but it's actually really super easy to use. And then if you're using MindMap, the nifty thing is you can save things to Google Drive. And there's the Google Drive icon. The first time you save something from MindMap into Google Drive, your computer will ask you, or Google will ask you, if you will allow MindMap access. You've experienced this likely with a few other things with your Google account. So once you authorize it once, until you change the permissions, it'll be, it'll continue to be able to do that. It's a fairly reputable program and company. I wouldn't be worried about that. They're not getting your password or whatever. They're just saving things into your drive. And so you can click on save. If we go over here to my Google Drive, look at that. It's your study cycle. Oops. Sorry. I'm cheap, so yeah, this is worth mentioning. So you can definitely save everything in Google Drive. If you are using the free version, then it will save a copy, but it's in its particular file extension. So you can see I'm still in Google Drive, and that's where it's actually saved. But you have to use their website as a viewer, but it comes right back. And like I said, it's on your drive. So it's actually an additional step. They have an in-drive viewer that's going to let it pop up, like you'll see like PDFs pop up or some Word docs pop up in the Google viewer. It's pretty, but you have to pay for it, and there's not really any reason to do that. So anyway, it's super easy to use also for, and this I strongly encourage you to sort of look into. You can embed it in a website, like, oh, I don't know, your Prep for Law portfolio. So that's something that that makes it very easy as well, is that you don't have to think about a lot of additional steps in the way that you do with other mind mapping programs when we're doing things with your portfolio site. So that is MindMap. That is your study cycle. Multitask into one presentation. If you have any questions about either the study cycle or about MindMap or other mind mapping or visual outlining software, just let me know. But I will leave it at that, let you explore the rest on your own. It's been fun.